That's okay. So we'll go ahead and start again. There any living organism that can transmit disease. And here's a list of just some of the more common vectors. So the high characteristics of these types of diseases are their high disease transmissibility. And that's facilitated by the multitudes of carriers that disperse from the source of infection and then go on searching for new victims. They're also difficult to control or prevent because of the vector's small size and their sheer numbers. Their outbreaks are sporadic, they can be epidemic, and importantly, unpredictable. And they also give rise to a larger geographic range than diseases that require direct one-to-one contact. As an example, think about someone who has to spread the flu. It has to literally spread from virtually direct to direct contact, as opposed to a mosquito that bites one individual and then flies off a distance to infect another and another and another. The larger geographic area reflects this type of transmission. In general, they also multiply very quickly. In terms of mosquitoes, a new generation can develop in standing water in as little as 4 or 5 days. So what is the effect of all these vectors? And there is a World Health Organization releases an annual report that identifies the animals, and for that purpose, humans are considered animals of the global human deaths caused by animals. And since this actual survey began, the number one predator by far has been the mosquitoes. They are the deadliest hunters of humans on the planet. They've killed more people than any other cause of death in history. The average annual human deaths are 1 to 2 million. And the female Anopheles mosquito is the world's deadliest animal. That's the one that transmits malaria. And in general, it's not general, but it's a female mosquitoes that actually do the biting, and they need that blood meal in order for their eggs to develop properly. The most prolific vector is the Aedes aegypti mosquito, infecting 300 to 400 million cases yearly. And this is a mosquito, it actually used to be known as the yellow fever mosquito. But this also transmits dengue, and last year there were approximately 300 million dengue cases globally. There were also tens of thousands of chikungunya, Zika, and even yellow fever. Think about yellow fever as being a mosquito-borne illness that has been controlled by a vaccine, which is true. But nonetheless, there are problems with vaccine distribution, and last year there were about 25,000 deaths attributed to yellow fever globally. We look at the second most important killer of human beings, it's human on human. But we were a distant second. So we had 500,000 deaths due to wars and those types of deaths. Snakes were number 3. Number 4 was sandflies and a condition known as, not named after me, but it's leishmaniasis. Dogs came in number 5. The freshwater snail and schistosomiasis. The sandfly is obviously a vector. The freshwater snail, also a vector. The kissing bug, 10,000 cases of deaths from a kissing bug. And it's interesting because my daughter just went to Peru for a 6 or 7 week rotation. She's in the PA program at Mississippi College. I I had to tell her, I said, look, under no circumstances do you stay under a thatched roof. Because that's where the kissing bugs actually lurk, and they come out at night, and they actually gravitate to the saliva and the moisture, and this is where they bite. Why they're called kissing bugs. There's a roundworm here, but no real vector for ascariasis. It's tsetse fly. If you've heard of the tsetse fly, that is the African version of Chagas, and it causes sleeping sickness. Scorpion number 10, and the fierce, ferocious killers of Hollywood lore. Crocodile, 1,000. Lions, about 100. Sharks, actually less than 10. I think sharks were maybe 4 cases, 4 fatalities last year. So, which do we fear more? This is actually a cartoon from last month. If you can read it, it's October 4th, 2019, BC. He sees a shark fin and, oh my God, shark. Well, there have been several hundred Hollywood movies about shark and shark attacks. In terms of mosquitoes, which are our number one predator, literally only documentaries. I'm going to read something from a book. I received this book. It's called The Mosquito, A Human History of Our Deadliest Predator by Timothy Weingard. This was for I think for Father's Day, and it gives you an idea of what my children think of me, I think. So the mosquito has killed more people than any other cause of death in human history. Statistical extrapolation suggests mosquito-inflicted deaths approach half of all humans that ever lived. In plain numbers, the mosquito has dispatched an estimated 52 billion people from a total of 108 billion throughout our relatively brief existence. So, as opposed to the sharks that we fear, this is the typical response to mosquitoes. Getting back to my daughter in Peru, I found out last night, she made the comment, Dad, they don't have air conditioning here. So it's not winter in Peru, it's actually summertime. So, how are you getting your fresh air? I was dreading what she was going to say. Well, we just keep the windows open. I said, you know what happens when you keep the windows open? He goes, oh, Dad, don't worry, no one can get in. I said, I'm not worried about the 2-legged variety. I'm worried about the 8-legged variety. And she knows what I've done, and mosquitoes and we at some point we should examine the psychology of why we fear something we have almost nil chance of ever being affected by, and what it is about us that we don't fear the ultimate predators, the ultimate killers of human beings. So they are the real killers. This one is from a Chinese anti-malarial poster about the terrifying diseased mosquitoes that carry death to the world and spread malaria. This is from the yellow fever epidemics of the late 1800s in the United States and actually in the Mississippi Valley. And there were tens of thousands of casualties. There were towns, there were 3,000 or 4,000 inhabitants, and with only 100 or 200 survivors in those towns during this particular epidemic. It reads here, God only knows when the suffering will stop. So this is the Chinese disease. Mosquitoes carry death to the world. Prevention means killing mosquitoes first, which actually this is still true today. So whether we're dealing with leishmaniasis and the sandfly, the gives rise to this type of condition. Or the schistosomiasis, which is transmitted through contact with snails that harbor these particular flatworms. Or the Chagas disease. If you look down here, more than 300,000 people in the United States are infected with Chagas, Trypanosoma cruzi. The trypanosomes that cause the disease, the parasite that causes Chagas, and most don't know it. They don't know it because immediately, even for years, there may not be any pertinent symptoms. But it's on the list of the 10 most deadly killers because after a time, Chagas can cause heart changes in your heart and changes in the internal organs. My mother studied Chagas. This was back in the 1980s. And at that time, the focus was to try to prevent Chagas from ever entering and becoming established in the United States. And the reality is that I actually saw a triatoma walking up to Methodist Rehab about 2 weeks ago. And so I actually picked it up. It had died. I didn't squish it or anything. But triatomas are widespread, and there are different species that can transmit these types of parasites. And here you have the tsetse fly and the African version with the sleeping sickness. I think all of us have at one point or another heard about sleeping sickness. It's a condition that also has high fatality. But whether we're talking about 3,000 to 4,000 years ago, and here, what I'm looking at here is the epidemic of Athens, Greece. This is during the Peloponnesian Wars when they were fighting, the Athenians were fighting the Spartans. And the Athenians were winning the war, the Second Peloponnesian War, until this mysterious disease destroyed 3/4 of the population in Athens. And historians and medical experts have never been able to confirm the etiology, the cause of this destruction. But most experts now think it was either typhus, which is actually a vector-borne disease. The lice, the louse, carry the parasite that causes typhus, or malaria. There have been some reports that it might have been a little bit later with Alexander the Great, that West Nile may have been the cause of Alexander the Great's death, because when he entered the city where he died, the roads were filled with dead birds. The dead birds were everywhere, but what the people from the city did was so that he would have no problem stepping on dead birds. They actually cleared the roadside and all the dead birds were on the side. And so that's a historical context that suggests that there were a lot of dead birds. And one of the very few viruses that can do that is West Nile virus. So whether or not it's 3,500 years ago or the common era, what these vectors do is they bring death and they bring human suffering. Before I actually was assigned this particular topic, I've worked with West Nile since 2002, and I never had that deep an appreciation for how much misery and how these mosquitoes and other vectors have actually changed human history. I would be a little remiss if I didn't mention the bubonic plague, because speaking about changing human history, there were two major pandemics with the bubonic plague, the Black Death. The vector is the rat flea, and the bacteria causing the plague is Yersinia pestis. And in 500 AD, it killed half the population of Europe, estimated half. The death toll was 25 million. It absolutely devastated Constantinople, which at that point was the capital, so to speak, of the Byzantine Empire, which was the continuation of the Roman Empire. It also had a second, even more destructive epidemic in 1346 to 53. It ravaged Europe, Africa, and Asia. It was a perfect storm because all three of these continents simultaneously, it just literally spread from one to the other. The death toll, an estimated 75 to 200 million. So let's switch gears a little bit and talk about the common arthropod vector-borne viruses. Because there have been some deadly ones. It's not on this list anymore because right now the most common transmitted disease is dengue. And again, anywhere from 300 to 400 million cases annually. And this is in spite of the fact that we actually have a vaccine for dengue. It hasn't been approved here in this country, but it is available, and it seemingly lessens the neuroinvasiveness of the dengue fever, the dengue hemorrhagic fever, and dengue toxic shock. West Nile we know about, and I'll continue talking about since we're here for the West Nile Support Group meeting. Zika, we've heard about because, again, this is one of the new kids on the block with respect to arthropod-borne viruses, and chikungunya. And if you notice a trend here, only dengue was on our radar screen 25 years ago. West Nile had several minor outbreaks. Neuroinvasive disease in West Nile was not a common feature, and had sporadic, mainly rural epidemics until the late 1990s. And at that point, it gained entry into the United States. Zika is relatively new. Zika had literally maybe 14 reported cases prior to 2014, 2015, and then it took off. It's now a global pathogen, and the same with chikungunya. These all have become major public health concerns. And one other thing, that there's a trend here, and that is that 3 out of the 4 have occurred really in not only our lifetime, but in our generation. And so, but if you look at some of these features here with dengue, it's typically equatorial, tropical, or subtropical, as opposed to West Nile that stretches from literally the mid-Canadian region all the way to the tip of Argentina. And that is because of the different hosts that actually help to transmit these viruses. In West Nile, it's going to be the bird populations that fly south and north for winter versus summer. So I was in a meeting of in Puerto Rico a few years ago, and the entire 4-day meeting was devoted to this particular mosquito, and that's the Aedes aegypti. That's a major carrier of chikungunya, of dengue, of Zika, and of yellow fever. You see here, this is from 2017, that obviously Aedes aegypti now, this is from CDC, their estimated range of Aedes aegypti in the United States. And you can see that it literally goes from Miami to California. Well, at this meeting, one of the surveillance groups that gave a talk mentioned that in any type of mosquito trap, when you see 3 to 5 Aedes aegypti mosquitoes, that can herald an outbreak. Three to five mosquitoes in a trap. Well, there were reports from Miami and from, and the tropical weather, the tropical climate in Miami, and in arid portions of California, with mosquito traps that held thousands of Aedes aegypti mosquitoes. And this prompted one of the top mosquito experts. And this is kind of a quote, we have not only lost the battle, we have lost the war. Any mosquito that can flourish in the tropical climates of Miami and the arid climates of Central California is unstoppable, unbeatable. So this was actually the same conference, and it was kind of interesting. We had assigned seating, and it was a round table, like King Arthur's round table, and there were groups at my table that did field surveys. One that did Zika field syndrome, and I was actually there for this meeting and to do a Zika microcephaly clinic in San Juan. There was a vector control group from CDC, and the dengue branch also funded through CDC. But it was interesting because when I started talking to the people who were seated at my table, none of us knew each other. It's okay they didn't know me. I was a foreigner, well, sort of a foreigner. And I dealt with West Nile. They don't deal so much with West Nile. They worry about the other 3 big ones. But they didn't know other people who were doing surveillance. So the surveillance teams at the various tables didn't know each other. And they had no idea that Dr. Yi, who was funded through, he was actually from the University of Southern Miss, was doing a very large scale survey of all the mosquitoes in Puerto Rico. So you had a lot of disconnection. You had a lot of surveillance groups surveying this part or that part or here or there, and none of them jumping on board to one, more comprehensive type of surveillance. The same was true for mosquito control, and maybe, Sharon, you may want to add to this, but there's a lot of money in mosquito control. I have no idea how much, but I would venture to say it's probably in the billions. You might want to just look that up, okay? Because the mosquito control groups weren't necessarily working together either. In fact, I know for a fact that some of the funding actually went to mosquito control groups that literally had no experience doing what they should have been doing. So there was more competition there, and that kind of, they didn't know the Zika people, they didn't know any of the doctors at the University of Puerto Rico. And that's the only academic center in San Juan. They didn't know the neonatologists who deal with Zika microcephaly and Zika fetal syndrome. And they didn't know the pediatricians to take care of these, afflicted children after they're born. And so that made me, essentially, I coined this term after about an hour and a half at this meeting because it occurred to me that we need to unite to fight the bite. Fight the bite is the slogan from the Mississippi State Department of Health. I don't know if they have proprietary rights to it or if it's used by every other state health organization. But really what we have to do is we have to do a better job of just communicating. And so there is a disconnect, and it's interfering. If it's interfering in Puerto Rico, it's probably interfering everywhere. Particularly if you're competing for a already relatively small pocket of funds. So sharing sources, we have to share sources, we have to share funding, it's really illogical to fund one single discipline. So I mean, literally, you can't fund just mosquito control without trying to at the same time fund, you know, some of the doctors who are taking care of these people, particularly in areas where medical resources are already very, very tight. So we know about West Nile. We know that this is the same group as dengue, number one, in terms of the frequency of infection. Zika, yellow fever, St. Louis, encephalitis Japanese. These are all famous viruses, so to speak. We know the transmission through the vector of the mosquito. We know how it entered North America in the New York City outbreak of 1999. At that time, the 7 human deaths were attributed to a Guillain-Barré syndrome condition, which is an autoimmune condition that could explain the weakness. I think all 7 of these actually ended up on the respirator. And we know how it spread. 1999, 2000, 2001, and 2002, and now literally worldwide. I sometimes joke about, you know, they had a way of looking for West Nile in Antarctica, and maybe they would find it there also, particularly with global warming. Anyhow, modes of transmission, there are various modes, and depending on the virus, these are going to change. Blood product transfusions, we know that U.S. blood donors are now routinely screened. Organ transplants can also transmit the virus. Mother to fetus has been documented. Breastfeeding has been documented. Certainly, if you're dissecting a blue jay that died recently from, you know, West Nile infection and it penetrates your skin, there is a possibility of transmission there also. There were about 3 or 4 cases of dialysis related of West Nile. Not necessarily, it's more of a negative testimonial as to hospitals where that happened. And I and probably others suspect that it might be transmissible through sex. We've had 2 or 3 couples that came down with West Nile virus simultaneously. 2 of those were actually hospitalized here at Methodist Rehab for recovery simultaneously. And we just suspected that the mosquitoes had bit, you know, the husband also bit the wife. But the reality is we never probed whether or not that could have been something else. Okay? As opposed to Zika. So in Zika, we had the perfect opportunity because there were 5,000 travelers who came to the United States and developed Zika in this country, and the same thing in European countries. And when the wife or the spouse came down with Zika, it became apparent that this was probably through sexual intercourse rather than mosquitoes. This is, in particular, there were areas where mosquitoes were not prevalent and not biting anyone else. So this is the cycle in nature. The host is the bird, and the vector is the Culex female mosquitoes. We are considered dead-end hosts because the virus, when it gets into the bloodstream, that so-called viremia or viremic phase, there isn't enough viral particles floating around in the bloodstream to allow the spread from the bite of a mosquito. In fact, the likelihood is very, very small that even if I developed West Nile virus and a mosquito bit me and then went on to bite you, the likelihood of you developing West Nile virus would be almost nil. just we're considered dead and hosts. So this is typically a summer event, typically from July to about October. But that doesn't mean that you can't have cases in January. Over the years, we've seen maybe a handful of cases that develop in either January, March, in really cold climate. And the reason for this is probably that some mosquitoes, and Culex mosquitoes in particular, can overwinter. And I recently read an article, I wish I could quote it now, but I didn't quite believe it, but it made mention of the fact that some Culex mosquitoes could actually survive for several months. For me, before reading this particular article, I actually expected the lifespan of a mosquito to be maybe maximum 1 month. Apparently, some Culex mosquitoes can overwinter. They do overwinter. And when they overwinter, they hide in decomposing leaves and other protected forest environments. And if you go walking through their home in January and stirring leaves and what have you, there is a possibility that they can bite and transmit with no virus. Incubation is anywhere from typically a week, would be probably the average between the bite and the onset of symptoms. And during this incubation period, there is a raging battle between your immune system and the virus. The virus is a neurotropic virus. Once it enters the center, your bloodstream, it's got a target, and the target is going to be gain access to brain or spinal cord. It'll first go into the lymphatics, and from lymphatics, it will enter the veins and arteries and spread to spleen, kidneys, liver, and eventually to brain and spinal cord. So the job of your first line immune system is to prevent that from happening, and gladly that happens in the majority of people. You're not in this room, you're not necessarily the majority, you're here because you were not the majority. And 80% develop antibodies and are protected from ever having West Nile virus infection again, without ever having sufficient symptoms to even report it to doctors. So we consider them to be asymptomatic. So CDC essentially classifies the symptoms as fever, which was traditionally considered a mild self-limiting infection, kind of a summer flu. And by definition, the neuroinvasion into the central nervous system does not occur. But we've been studying it, and others have too, since 2002. And we now have some biochemical evidence that about 40% of the time, the diagnosis may be incorrect. In other words, based on symptoms, the state health departments typically classify the patient as having fever only, but then we check blood and realize that there are some proteins that primarily come from brain or spinal cord that are floating around in the bloodstream, and we suspect that these proteins got there because the virus was indeed neuroinvasive, and that was just missed. We found that to be the case here, and that was also found to be the case in Europe, who actually looked at a different protein from the brain. And in our studies, roughly 40% of the cases were mislabeled as West Nile fever. In the European studies, 41% were mislabeled as being West Nile fever. These are the typical symptoms: the summer flu, fever, chills, headaches, body aches and pains, nausea, vomiting, constipation, oftentimes a rash, but the rash may be seen in probably less than half. opposed to Zika, where you have, if you don't have a rash, rethink the diagnosis because the rash is so prevalent in Zika. It's the majority, 80, 90% of the time. Also, you have a rash, you get like blood red eyes, conjunctival redness in Zika, but not necessarily in West Nile. And you can have this adenopathy or swollen lymph nodes. Meningitis is just a classic meningitis, and that's an inflammation of the lining around the brain and spinal cord. You get the fever, headaches, lethargy, nausea, vomiting, dehydration. Muscle stiffness is almost always there. And as a doctor, one of the first things I do if I suspect that, I take the patient will be sitting supine. I'll take my hand, put it underneath the head, and lift gently. With patients who have suspected meningitis, they're not going to let you lift gently. So you do this, the muscle is tense, and you have what we call neck rigidity or nuchal rigidity, and that's one of the classic features that you're dealing with a meningitis. And ultimately, you develop the encephalitis. And this is much more neuroinvasive because it means that the virus has penetrated the lining around the brain and is now targeting actual neurons and neuronal connections inside the brain. We know that they can target areas in the middle of the brain that influence the rate, range, and force of movement. They can target that the cerebellum, and they can target other areas. So I'm going to give you a typical case of West Nile encephalitis. This was a 71-year-old woman. She had fever to almost 103. And then she went from lucid and clear to developing delirium and stupor. She had severe generalized weakness. She had what we call brain stem signs with difficulty swallowing, slurring of speech, and one eye looking one way, the other eye looking the other way. We call disconjugate gaze. So the consciousness remained impaired for 9 days, and at that time, one of her neurologists at Baptist, actually, he entered this in his book. The patient is critically ill with fulminant neurological deterioration, with potential for further deterioration and possibly death. So this is these are the typical symptoms of West Nile encephalitis, and we actually wrote her up, and in a paper called "The Lazarus Effect of High-Dose Corticosteroids in a Patient with West Nile Virus Encephalitis: A Coincidence or a Clue?" And the reality is that I think I and my team were probably a little remiss because we've been using this treatment since 2002. And I know from just reading these sporadic case reports that others have been doing the same. But what we haven't done is actually gotten organized and looked at all the times we actually treated patients this way. I would say that anecdotally, I would say that this typically is a not uncommon response to very high dose steroids. Typically, I would urge one to use intravenous high dose steroids for 5 days, and then slowly taper the steroids over the ensuing month. There's one case series of 12 patients, but the fact that it was reported at one of the meetings in about 2004, 2005, but never followed up with a publication tells me that whoever the reviewers were rejected the paper. It was clearly just a tremendous error. I actually meant to contact the author. I haven't done that. Because even now, if she still has all the data, it would still be a publication. Should be a publication. Anyhow, this patient responded very quickly, and literally within 24 hours, we knew that there was some improvement. And by day 2, it was absolutely clear. Uh, she was actually beginning to laugh at her husband's jokes again. Okay, anyhow, our involvement with West Nile virus actually came in 2002. I think I've mentioned this before. We saw 3 patients in rapid sequence. The first patient came in, he had just this very weird asymmetric distribution for the weakness. 3 limbs were literally knocked out, and 1 was literally normal. We kind of knew that this was a poliomyelitis because when I performed the EMG studies, I had seen a whole lot of cases of post-polio syndrome from a doctor, his name was Dr. Michael Winkelman. He had been sending me his post-polio cases for a long time, and he had one of the largest post-polio clinics in the Deep South. And so I knew that, 3 limbs, this has got to be some type of poliomyelitis. What we didn't know at that time was that no one had ever described West Nile virus poliomyelitis. Saw a second case a couple of weeks later. Unfortunately, that individual who was really a mainstay for our support group meeting for so long, he recently passed away. But we learned a lot from those first 2 cases. And then we saw our third case in early August of 2002. I'm going to go ahead and report him because he's a 49-year-old man who developed all these symptoms, except that he had no fever, no pain, numbness, or paresthesia, or altered sensation. He went to the emergency room 3 times in a very short period of about 2 days, and was diagnosed with a bunch of diagnoses, all of which were incorrect. MRI of the brain and spinal cord. In fact, because the MRI of the brain and spinal cord were normal, spinal fluid was not done because they didn't think about doing it. When you start thinking about things like malingering and GI conditions, food poisoning, typically we're not going to do a spinal tap, but they just didn't consider West Nile. Fortunately, the patient, this particular one, had actually listened to some, not podcast, but we had gotten the word out that West Nile was doing this. And he actually contacted us and said, hey, I think I got this polio thing. And we brought him in and examined him. And sure enough, this is about a month and a half after the acute illness. And you can see his right arm is completely flaccid. It was completely flaccid by his side. Here he was instructed to lift up both arms. He had no movement at all. You can actually start seeing the early atrophy of the shoulder girdle muscles on the right. And even now, you can see here the first dorsal interosseous muscle where there's been a cavity because this is atrophy that also involved not muscles literally from the fingers and hands all the way up to the upper shoulders. We did studies that I do routinely, and I will just let you know that based on these studies, the size of a response here, for example, let's see, the shoulder muscle here is 0.1 on the right side that was affected compared to 7.2 on the left. And just by amplitude comparison, this would suggest that he's lost close to 98% of his connections. His sensory responses were all normal. He wasn't complaining of numbness, tingling, or altered sensation. So we knew by the time we had these 3 cases in rapid sequence, we knew we were dealing with a poliomyelitis. And at that time, we invited the CDC to come into our hospital here, and they actually set up, they stayed here for about a week and a half, examined these cases, and then we reported them together in the CDC journal uh, about a month later. Jonathan Fratkin at the university was actually the first who actually got these beautiful pictures of autopsy cases. And this is a healthy looking motor neuron with a nucleus right smack in the middle, right there. Compared to the nucleus here in this hugely swollen motor neuron that's about to die. And here's the nucleus here compared to where it should be in the middle of this particular neuron. And so this is what West Nile virus does. It targets these neurons in the brain and in the spinal cord. After a period of a day or two, what you have left is this. This is actually looking at the remnants of this. What this particular neuron is going to be in a couple of days is what this one was a few days ago. We actually examined him 13 years later, and he was still very weak in that shoulder girdle. He recovered his hand function because the hand function had only lost about 70% of the connections based on the amplitude comparison. And we concluded, as have others at this point, that temporal profile recovery from West Nile poliomyelitis is dependent on the degree of motor neuron loss. The virus also targets the brainstem. This is a patient who actually had a left facial paralysis that actually started about day 20 after the onset of the symptoms. And this patient here who had bifacial weakness, weakness of eye closure bilaterally, his jaw literally dropped because the muscles of mastication that allow you to, chew and close your mouth were so weak that the mouth just kind of hung open. So what's new in West Nile virus? This is about, we suspected that even though it's relatively new, it's only new because there's only very little literature on these topics. So the autonomic nervous system is, believe it or not, your major nervous system. There are millions upon millions of connections in this system, more than the system that gives rise to motor fibers that supply the muscles of the human body. So this is by far the more predominant nervous system, controls heart rate, blood pressure, all these automatic bodily functions, bowel and bladder, sweating, even pupillary size is determined by this nervous system. So if you have, problems with the autonomic nervous system, you're going to suffer from sudden changes in blood pressure, heart rate irregularities. Heart rate can go way up, it can go way down. I'll show you a patient where it went way up and way down. I would say simultaneously, but not really quite simultaneously. Fatigue, exercise intolerance, tremors. Tremors are clearly a feature of West Nile virus infection. I think Dr. Jim Savar from CDC was actually the first one to actually recognize that, this is really common in patients with West Nile virus infection. I thought it was just because they were so weak that it was attributed to them being tremulous and kind of shivering and shaking. But no, these are actually true tremors that can actually persist. It's a hyperexcitability state after this infection that increases sometimes even reflexes and it puts everything in hyperactive drive, including the tremors. The GI dysmotility, the gut can shut down. We knew from before that this happens routinely in animals. There can be sweating changes, breathing problems, vision changes, swelling, and sexual dysfunction. All this can occur because of the uh, involvement of the autonomic nerves. So this is one of the cases. This is a 79-year-old who had typical features of West Nile fever, but then developed a poliomyelitis. He was confused, had respiratory failure. He had weakness in 3 4 limbs, and he had very labile blood pressure. This is the patient who I sometimes mention that the first time I ran up there, I was talking to him, and one of the nurses raised the head of the bed, and he stopped talking. And I said, what happened? And the nurse said, you know, lower the bed, and lowered the bed, and he started talking, was doing conversation, raised it up. He actually lost consciousness again because his autonomic nervous system was so impaired that it couldn't keep the vessels. You have vasoconstriction that keeps the vessels, the blood pumping to the brain, and with autonomic failure, you can't do that. And so when you sit them up, the blood drains from the brain, and they lose consciousness. He also had cardiac issues, hemodynamic instability, heart rate's less than 40, and literally I probably got called a half dozen times. It was at that time here at the rehab center, it was any physician stat, 5th floor, and I knew exactly who I was running up to try to evaluate. But I remember several times the blood pressure was bottoming out, and heart rate was really low. Other times heart rate was much higher. You can also lose bowel and bladder control and GI, what we call pseudo obstruction. And this causes a bloating of the stomach. This patient was discharged and died suddenly about 3 weeks after, which is also a feature of autonomic instability. So we know from, again, Jonathan Fradkin's work that you have a pathological diagnosis that shows you that sympathetic ganglion cells that control cardiac rhythm can indeed be attacked and destroyed by this virus. We also had work, even prior work from the animal scientists who knew that when you have West Nile virus, the intestines can bloat up, and they don't work. It's all smooth muscle controlled by the autonomic nervous system, and this is the result. This is what it should look like, and you start realizing these are hugely dilated loops, where it should be more like this. So I want to just talk about our poster child, because she had pretty much everything I just mentioned. These symptoms were progressive. They didn't start immediately. Some of them did, but a lot of them did not start until weeks later. But she had the lymphadenopathy, pressure in my head like I'd never felt before, head and neck rigidity and stiffness. It's weak, I couldn't suck through a straw or swallow. It's shaking, can't talk, can't hold my head up, glazed eyes, feel like death. Was confused, but she had very little fever. So again, she developed every one of these problems. Gastroparesis, her gut shut down. She had heart rate rhythm problems. She would stand up and feel like she was going to faint. She developed autoimmune POTS, which is a postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome. So you stand for over just a minute or two, your heart rate starts going up, and she had heart rate fluctuations that going from the 40s to 180s, and this was not triggered by movement or exercise per se. Also started losing her hair, toenails started falling off, she had dry mouth. And this is a more recent photograph showing that this has persisted. So this is what her abdomen looks like when she's not having any type of viral infection, but a viral infection alone any viral infection, presumably. She is a kindergarten teacher, and she's always getting viral infections, and this is what one of the consequences of the viral infection. So you have maximum heart rate changes from 197 to 30s or 40s. And so she did doctor shopping for a long time. She started training. She was told to start training and running to reset her heart. And she jotted down, you can only imagine how angry I felt. So she was a USM graduate, Southern Miss graduate, and her major was dance performance. We treated her with immunotherapy with intravenous immune globulin. It's very, very expensive. And she actually did very well for several years. She continued, it was a partial benefit to some of her symptoms, but not all of them. And this is kind of what we're seeing with treatment of IVIG. It will make some symptoms and clearly improve some, but these symptoms she was having were multiple symptoms in multiple organ systems. And overall, I pretty much have reached the conclusion that whether it's West Nile or another etiology, I doubt that all symptoms are going to respond the same way to the same medication. So now, typically supportive care is still the standard, but hopefully from some of the work that we've done and some of the absolutely great patients that we've had, we now know that there is a possibility of some intervention. I prefer intervening early rather than late, but these are some choices that were not apparent or obvious to us in prior years. I think I'm going to stop right there and just field any questions. Go ahead, please. It's a very good question, which I'll try to answer. So the question was, someone who shows up to the emergency room with 105-degree temperature, uh, they have already confused, what were the other symptoms? Yeah, double vision, so clearly brainstem dysfunction, extreme headache, and very just generalized weakness and very little use of the legs. What is your chances of survival and having a beneficial outcome or a favorable outcome? I'll tell you, I would wonder why they delayed number one, okay? Why there was a relative delay to going to the emergency room. Okay, so he actually is talking about himself, and for 2 or 3 weeks, he actually thought he was suffering from the flu. So just one word of caution: flu does not occur in summer months. So that would be, I will assume that statistically this happened either July, August, September, or October, or November. Yeah, so he was diagnosed in August with flu and sent home to take Tamiflu. And you know what? Here's the commentary. If you had gone back to another emergency room, they would have given you the same type of treatment. They would have diagnosed flu and treated you with the same thing. And the reason is that ER doctors are very good at doing what they're very good at doing, but they don't expand the differential diagnoses. They'll just say, well, this is, it's not, it's a kind of aberrant, it's unusual to have a flu in August. They don't think that it's like really unusual to have a flu in August, unless you were in the southern or northern hemisphere and traveled back and then became infected at that point. But the differential diagnosis is that's not what emergency room doctors are good at doing. So, but they certainly should have given you a spinal tap. They would have first gotten a CT scan to clear your head of any type of abnormality. Even though you felt the way you did on death's door, the reality is your brain MRI was probably, brain CT was almost certainly normal, because the CT scan looks for big stuff, huge strokes, huge intracranial bleeds, hematomas, epidural hematomas, subdural hematomas, things of that nature. It will not look for a lining of meninges and meningitis. The reality is that I would have been concerned the same way this doctor was concerned when Dr. Bush over there was essentially going downhill. I would have been concerned about death. I would not, but the reality is that at that point, I probably would have given you, when they found out that you did not have a bacterial meningitis, that would probably, they did the spinal tap and they probably started you either way on massive amounts and numbers of antibiotics to treat the meningitis. I've seen patients now, it's not uncommon for them to be on 4 different antibiotics, trying to make sure they don't miss a treatable condition like a bacterial meningitis. They did that, and by the time your spinal fluid started showing evidence of a viral meningitis, it would have said, he's going to live. And they probably would have fairly rapidly sent you home. So your evaluation from emergency room discharge was 5 days. Okay, that's good. And your doctor, you went multiple times to see your doctor. That's typical. That's not the exception. Okay, and if you have more than one doctor, or you rely on the MEAs and MEIA like clinics, like my number 3 case, he visited more than one emergency room. And when they found that out, they actually thought he was malingering, although he was never asking for any type of narcotics or any other thing to malinger for. It was just an issue that we have got to. We've talked about it at Mosquito Illness Alliance to blue in the face. So I mean, how do you get doctors to expand their differential diagnosis? We're not sure. That's really what has to happen. What year were you infected with West Nile? 2009. In 2009, it was much quicker in 2009. So there was probably a turnover still of about 4 days in 2009, which is not so quick when you're in the emergency room. But yeah, so they initially would have suspected a bacterial meningitis, and they would have been wearing masks initially. Okay, they may have thought brain bleed or stroke or whatever initially, but the CT scan, which you probably had within the first hour of setting foot in the emergency room, would have said no, and then they would have thought bacterial infection. That's when you saw them wearing the masks. Once you have a diagnosis of this being what we call an aseptic, the term that for you would have been aseptic meningitis, most of the patients are sent home because the misconception at a literally global ER level is that there's nothing you can do about a virus. You would have been eventually sent home. They would never send you home without confirmation that it was not a bacterial meningitis. Okay, yeah. Yeah, um, no, I would disagree. And the reason I would disagree is that uh, I'm not sure what type of, you haven't mentioned what type of intervention you had that actually benefited you. The fact that you received multiple antibiotics, they really don't do anything for viruses in general. Steroids, I would say yes. Okay, in 2009, antibiotics, that would be unusual treatment because they would have noticed, they would have known at that point that this is an aseptic meningitis. I'm not really sure. I would like to study your records. Yeah, because I'd like to see what they were thinking because if they had you at home with a drip, um, that's probably a good thing, okay? But I can't right now, based on your history, I can't really determine what they were thinking. Okay, so you use about a 2 week delay when it started. They put in the PIC lines and started well, the steroids presumably with or without antibiotics. I mean that's okay. But this was done by your primary care doctor, your PCP, your primary care doctor, or not? What kind of doctor is he? Okay, so I mean that's fine. That's fine. As long as one of the drugs was steroids, that's fine. Um, if he had to give you IV antibiotics because he thought we were missing, they were missing a bacterial infection, I would probably think he would have brought you into the hospital. I'm gonna go ahead and answer this other question.
From Sam J. What steps could a recently diagnosed West Nile virus patient take to increase their chances of a relatively full recovery? You mentioned corticosteroid treatment. That be recommended for a patient diagnosed with meningitis due to West Nile virus.
Okay, so the issue is what can a patient do to increase their chances of a better recovery? And if they have, for example, meningitis, which actually overlaps your comment, they have meningitis, should they be started on steroids? Um, I have to, I have to make sure that you understand that when I use steroids, I did so in cases uh, like Dr. Bush over there, where I knew or someone suspected that things could become very bad very quickly or had reached that point. Okay? If I develop West Nile virus infection and I have meningitis, and I have the wherewithal to convince the doctors to give me high dose steroids, that's exactly what I would do. Okay? And why? Because by the time you have a West Nile virus positive antibody, I am going to argue the case that the virus has been cleared from your body. And I can present a very cogent argument to support that statement. It took literally from 1999 to 2000, and it took 4 summers and almost 3,000 cases where CDC was trying to isolate West Nile virus from anyone who had it. It took that long before they were able to isolate the virus. And that first case was in the late 2002, and it was in a lady who had a non-Hodgkin's lymphoma and was on 3 different chemotherapy immunosuppressive agents. So she couldn't form IgG or IgM. They isolated the virus. My argument is, if your immune system is capable of producing IgM antibody, then I would treat with high dose steroids. When you go to the emergency room, they don't have that information. They're not going to know why you have meningitis. When you have aseptic meningitis, they probably are not going to even look for the cause. That's mistake number 1. Okay, they've cleared the bacterial meningitis. They're going to diagnose you with an aseptic, that means no bacterial, an aseptic meningitis, and they're probably going to discharge you. That's what has happened countless times. It'll probably continue to happen until we let most doctors know that, no, you probably should pursue the diagnosis. There were 2 huge studies, one done by the group in Houston, which is really the reigning West Nile virus groups, 2 groups in the country. And they did one Houston study that was over 6 different hospitals, it was over 6 or 7 years. And they realized that the majority of people who go into the emergency room and who are hospitalized with a meningitis or an encephalitis that isn't caused by bacteria, the doctors do not pursue diagnoses. The majority don't. Only high 30 percentile or 40% at most of these cases were diagnosed with aseptic meningitis or even a viral encephalitis. Only the minority are ever going to have West Nile, even in summer months. The Arizona group found the same thing. I mean, it's irrefutable. Once the ER docs, the first line doctors think only about saving your life and not you succumbing to a treatable infection. They regard viral infections as non-treatable. That is the problem. But with respect to West Nile virus, once you have an antibody, then there is ample evidence that you've cleared the virus from your body. And at that point, I would treat myself with high dose steroids. I really can't, as a scientist, I really can't say everyone should do it. I certainly would do it for myself.
Next question is from Joyce. She said, my husband is always cold, even if sitting in the hot sun. Anything be done to help with this?
So what right away, what you're describing is a dysregulation of temperature. And so that really reeks of an autonomic nervous system problem. And in particular, if this came on acutely or subacutely, I would think about autoimmune conditions that can alter or attack or cause dysfunction in the autonomic nervous system. I would say the first thing I would do is probably get some basic bedside testing to see if his heart rate responds appropriately, meaning when he's lying down, when he's sitting, when he's standing up. That would be probably my first screen to make sure his cardiovascular functions are okay. If he stands up and his blood pressure drops, that's evidence of impaired autonomic function, an autonomic disturbance that we call dysautonomia. If he stands up and is able to maintain the blood pressure, but still his heart rate goes way, way, way up and keeps on climbing, then that's the evidence of what we call POTS, P-O-T-S, for postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome. And either way, if this goes along with things like lack of proper sweating, either too much or too little sweating, or people that don't dilate the way they should to light, the light reflex is dulled or slow, or difficulty when they stand up feeling lightheaded or woozy. I would say all these things, or erectile dysfunction, depending on his age. If you're 80, it may not mean anything. If he's 55, it may also mean that there is dysautonomia, autonomic nervous system impairment. But
she just responded and said,
okay, he is unable to stand up. I'll assume he's unable to stand up because either he drops his blood pressure like the patient I was describing, or he stands up for 10 minutes and then his heart rate goes up so high that it begins to actually impair the heart pumping mechanism. Why are his legs paralyzed? So if the legs are paralyzed, I think what's happening is that he stands up and blood is being pooled in the lower limbs. And that means it's coming from somewhere, and that would be he's coming from his brain, and that's why he's passing out. But with respect to legs not working or becoming paralyzed, if this is due to West Nile virus, then I'd like to talk to you more. But it could be due to so many other things, including spinal cord injury. Okay. So my recommendation first, you have to go to a center that has an accredited autonomic nervous system lab. And so they will then, when they document how much dysfunction there is, they will tell you exactly what you need in terms of fluid intake. It's almost certainly going to be high sodium intake. They'll probably treat you with a drug called Florinef, which is a steroid. But also you need to go to, I tell you, if you live in Tennessee, it would be Vanderbilt, or even UAB now has a certified autonomic nervous system program. Any of the Mayo clinics in Arizona or in Florida or in Minnesota have great labs with respect to autonomic dysfunction. NYU is probably one of the best in the world. NYU would be able to tell you what's going on and how to try to fix it. At the very least, I would tell you that they would be able to control some of those symptoms. I'd also just like for you to get in touch with me, and I'll have Sharon follow through. So I'd like to know exactly how all the details of how he was infected and where you are now, and we will continue this.
Question is from Allison Shearer. Said, my mom is not responding to steroid treatment. It's an indication of permanent brain function loss.
Okay, so so the mom is not responding to steroid treatment. I would say that just in the question alone is we have way too little data and information. Okay, if patients don't respond to steroid treatment, the reality is we haven't done enough studies to actually say that everyone's going to improve. One of the reasons we're getting out papers right now is we realize that no one's ever going to use high dose steroids or immunosuppressants unless we get the literature out and say, look, clinicians have been using this since 2002, and we have to get together and organize and start some large, controlled, probably multi-center trials, almost certainly multi-center, because this is a sporadic vector-borne illness. We don't know when we're going to have a year where we have 1,000 cases or a year when we have 10,000 cases. We've got to organize that. Houston, if you're listening, we got a problem. But yeah, we need to do much more before I can make that type of definitive statement. If your mother, I know your mother is elderly, but right now, if she's not responding to steroids, it may be a number of things. If she was going to have a beneficial effect, I'll tell you, typically I give steroids to patients, and that's my recommendation dating back to 2002. And those are people who are acutely ill, and most of them had the poliomyelitis variant. And because we were the first to get the word out, there were a lot of calls initially, and I said, well, I think we should do this, with respect to high dose of steroids. But if there has been a time that has lapsed between her infection and her current condition, I got to tell you, I don't necessarily expect that one would see a whole lot of benefit. And there, I'm talking about treating acute cases. I don't know about treating chronic patients. I don't know about treating patients who've been in that position for months. And ultimately, if the virus, keep in mind, the 15% mortality is directed at people who are elderly and those who are already immunocompromised. She fits one of those two categories. It really could be that the virus destroyed so much of her neuronal network that no matter what's going to happen at this point, many of her neurons could look like that big bloated one that was about to die. And in that case, it's that massive neuronal loss is not going to be expected to be reversed by steroids or any other treatment. Okay, so she's been unresponsive for 9 weeks. I frankly, I couldn't even begin to give you any false hope that steroids at this point would, or any other intervention at this point would be therapeutic or have any benefit. Sorry.
Last question is from William Alford. Following West Nile encephalitis, some paralysis be associated with decreased neural drive instead of damage to the dorsal horn and subsequent flaccid paralysis. asked because it has now become somewhat popular in the sports arena among professional teams to increase the neural drive with transcranial direct current stimulation during training. There are many trials supporting this in the literature. This is something that should be considered for recovering West Nile patients.
Okay, so I'll tell you something. No one did more brain stimulation than the Division of Restorative Neurology and Human Neurobiology at Baylor College of Medicine uh, in the late 1980s, and I was an integral part of that group. Um, the fact that you're talking about athletes, presumably with injuries or who receive brain stimulation, I assume that you're talking about magnetic brain stimulation. So you do transcranial stimulation, and you can activate the motor cortex to and depolarize the motor fibers, the neurons. They will fire. It will actually give you a volley that you can actually record from muscle groups. So if you stimulate the left motor cortex, you can control. You can actually measure the latency, the size of the response from muscles in the right arm or right leg, depending on how you tweak and the geometry of the magnet on the scalp. Uh, Having said that, it's, believe me, transcranial magnetic stimulation at a bunch of different frequencies has been used for virtually everything now. And I would say there's a doctor, I think he may still be at Boston. His name is Alvaro Pascual Leon. I would literally, I mean, he was a genius with respect to transcranial magnetic stimulation. He used it effectively to treat a number of conditions, including things like depression. I just don't know if he's still doing that type of work. We've parted, we've gone separate ways in the past couple of decades. But I know that I would be hesitant to say that simply activating a nerve volley, I don't see exactly how that would essentially improve either regeneration or the recovery process. If you could just go ahead before you leave, just put down a paper or two that can show a mechanism that's scientifically viable, then I may reassess. Thank you all. Huge group here today. Huge. No, I listen. I mean, it was ugly weather out there, so I'm glad that we even have. You're very welcome. Okay.